As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
All right, so this story just broke as I finished recording the full show. The U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria. The Pentagon announced this on Thursday night, said that they targeted 2 facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups, and this is a significant escalation that makes a regional war more likely amid Israel's bombardment of Gaza. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a statement that the strikes were in response to the series of rocket and drone attacks that have targeted U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria in recent weeks, which the U.S. is blaming on Iranian-backed militias, referring to the Shia militias that operate in the region. Austin said, quote, "These precision self-defense strikes are a response to a series of ongoing and mostly unsuccessful attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed militia groups that began on October 17th, end quote. Recently, a U.S. official actually told CNN that how willing these groups are to act independently of Iran is a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S. So that's them basically saying they don't know how often they will just act on their own or if they're acting on behalf of Iran. So the point here is that the U.S. doesn't really know if Iran is directing these attacks or not. So just keep that in mind because you're going to see the hawks, try to drum up war with Iran. So the increase in attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria was due to President Biden's support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And now, again, I've said that this has happened before where Biden bombed eastern Syria or Iraq, targeting specifically, the Shia militias. And usually it's a flare-up that happens over some rocket attacks on U.S. bases. The U.S. bombs them, usually kills a few dozen. Right now, this is Thursday night. No reports about the casualties. I'm sure that'll become clear on Friday. But what usually happens in these flare-ups, the U.S. bombs them. They might fire some more rockets, but if no U.S. troops get killed, then maybe the U.S. stops the bombing, or the U.S. launches some airstrikes again, and then that's it. Somebody backs down. But I think the situation, what I'm worried about is, I expected that the U.S. was going to do something like this, and what I'm worried about is that they're not going to back down this time because of what's going on with Gaza, because of how much Israel's bombing Syria. I mean, there's just so much going on now that I think a lot of these groups that want the U.S. out of Iraq and out of Syria might really ramp this stuff up this time. A group of Republican senators have introduced a bill that would give Israel $14.3 billion in additional military aid to support its onslaught on Gaza, separating the funds from the $105 billion request from President Biden that includes funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and border security. So this bill was introduced by Senators Roger Marshall, J.D. Vance, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz. It would provide $10.6 billion for Israel through the Pentagon, $3.5 billion for the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, and $200 million to help protect U.S. diplomatic facilities. And this is on top of the $3.8 billion that Israel receives from the U.S. each year in military aid. So this is about the same amount that Biden requested, about $14 billion in that huge spending package that he's requested that includes Ukraine, Taiwan, and all the other stuff. So these senators want to separate spending for Israel from Ukraine so additional military aid can be sent to Israel as quickly as possible. President Biden's request includes $61 billion for Ukraine, and that's designed to fund the war in Ukraine for a whole year. So Senator Marshall said in a statement, quote, "My colleagues and I firmly believe that any aid to Israel should not be used as leverage to send tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Any package that does so would result in funds and resources being delayed in Israel's time of need. The legislation we've introduced provides the aid to Israel requested by the Biden administration and should be considered by the Senate immediately," end quote. So the U.S. has already shipped additional military equipment to Israel using funds that they had and deployed all that firepower to the region. So the brutal Hamas massacre on October 7th was preceded by months of warning signs noted by IDF surveillance soldiers and disregarded as unimportant by intelligence officials, according to eyewitness accounts given in recent days. At least 3 months prior to the attack, surveillance soldiers serving on a base in Nahal Oz reported signs that something unusual was underway at the already tumultuous Gaza border, situated a kilometer from them. So the activity reported by the soldiers included information on Hamas operatives conducting training sessions multiple times a day, digging holes and placing explosives along the border. According to reports of the soldiers, no action was taken by those who received the reports. So essentially, this is more evidence that the Israeli government did receive warnings that something was coming, and that they didn't take any action to prevent it. The Egyptians said that they warned them something big was coming, and now we have this. And this is Israeli media, and if you read Israeli media, I read the English language versions, but you have Haaretz, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post. They are all very critical of the Netanyahu government for this attack and everything. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The new government of Slovakia has followed through with its campaign pledge to terminate arms transfers and is calling on the rest of Europe to adopt Slovakia's policy. Slovakia's new leader, Robert Fico, has called for the European Union to take on a peacekeeper role in the Ukraine war, and Slovakia will not support further sanctions on Moscow. So he told members of Slovakia's legislature on Thursday that Slovakia was abandoning the West's proxy war against Russia. He said, quote, "I will support zero military aid to Ukraine. An immediate halt to military operations is the best solution we have for Ukraine. The EU should change from an arms supplier to a peacemaker," end quote. So significant that a NATO member has a government that is all in on cutting off Ukraine completely and not playing the game at all. He also said that Slovakia would not support sanctions. And the question is if that's really going to have an impact on the EU sanctions and stuff.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
And World War III already began with the Ukraine war. Oh, the Ukraine war is out of the news. Fuck the Ukrainians. Who cares about them? Nobody cares. Began with that. So now you got the Ukraine war that's still going on. Several million refugees that fled Ukraine, their lives destroyed. And I've been warning over and over again, when all else fails, they're also going to do a false flag event or attack a nuclear power plant, do something to that effect, so Ukraine gets back in the news. Again, when all else fails, they take you to war. And the global economy is failing. High borrowing costs pose threat to resilient economy. Well, this is in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Treasury route deters companies from borrowing as finance costs soar. Yeah, no shit. You ready? UN report says global economy could be heading for systemic crisis. The latest UN Trade and Development Report presents a picture of a global economy wrecked by lower investment, again, high interest rates, and growth, the increased domination of giant corporations, the big zone everything, all you are plantation workers of Slavelandia, financial speculation, a falling share of labor income, and rising social inequality. Again, all old news. All old news that we have been forecasting on and on and on. Oh, this is from the Financial Times. Shanghai and Shenzhen stocks dropped to pre-COVID lows as growth fears intensify. No fucking shit. At 3 years of zero COVID policy, they destroyed the lives and livelihoods of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in China. And it's global, as the reports are showing. Oh, the NASDAQ now? Oh, it's in correction territory. It's down over 10%. The worst is yet to come. And that's why you subscribe to the Trends Journal. Today's New York Times, or Tuesdays, excuse me. Developing world accuses West of double standard over Gaza and Ukraine. Gaza deaths rise as anger flares in UN speeches. Look at the slaughter. U.S. Now, this is very important because it goes back to your top trends for 2023, Middle East meltdown, where we said they're going to drag Iran into this. And if Iran gets into this, it's going to be the end of life on Earth. It's going to be World War III escalated into a nuclear war. U.S. moves to deter Iran from entering conflict ahead of Israel's Gaza invasion. So it's okay for Israel to invade Gaza. And the U.S. is using Israel's blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's a warning, right? U.S. may target Iranian crude. Strategist. Washington is likely to tighten crude oil sanctions against Iran over Iran's alleged support for Palestinian militant groups in Hamas. The head of global commodity strategy at RBC Capitals Markets, Helma Croft, has said. Talking on CNBC, Croft suggested that the West and the Biden administration would, quote, at a minimum, curb Iranian energy exports. The argument is you can continue to allow Iran to keep the bank open for groups like Hamas. No, that's what she says, yep. Blinken warns Iran as militants backed by Tehran stage attacks. Today's Wall Street Journal, front page. Again, what we're giving you, nobody's giving you anywhere else. All things are connected. Opportunity misses those who view the world through the eyes of their profession. We look at things for the way they are, not the way we want them to be. I'm telling you, Mini's meltdown has begun, and they're ramping up the war against Iran. Weapons flood West Bank, fueling fears of new war front. You ready? Tehran and its allies operate a smuggling network that crosses hundreds of miles and at least 4 borders, spew out Sunni Angla Ramusin and Banat Fulkan. Yeah, fuck you, Khan. Who the fuck are you to say this shit? Oh, we're repeating the crap that they shoved down our throats, Celente. We're prostitutes. We're media whores that get paid to put out by our corporate pimps and our government whore masters. Because we're war whores on parade. Then you go on top of that. You ready? Here it is. Take a look. Hamas fighters had trained in Iran before Israel attacked. You see where this is leading? And again, you are not allowed to say anything contrary to the shit coming out and the shitheads in charge, like that arrogant fucking prick over there in Florida, the DeSantis. Yeah, the little fucking warmongering DeSantis. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis bans pro-Palestinian student organizations. The State University system in Florida said on Tuesday that it would dismantle chapters of the Students for Justice of Palestine. You got to get all those Jewish folks down in Florida, huh? As you're failing to run in the presidential election and even getting close to Trump. Dump. This is the fuck that was down in Guantanamo that kept that going over there. You like murder, don't you? Where is your soul? Where is your spirit for peace? As I said, when all else fails, they take you to war, and you're watching it fail in front of us. The future's in your hands. Don't drop it. It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men since Samuel Adams. And we're that irate, tireless minority. United we stand, divided we die.
We feel that one thing we could do is look at people that claim to be speaking rationally when in fact they are advocating for profiteering without even disclosing it. The legacy media should not be showcasing the voices of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin without telling you plainly that's what they're doing. I would say more important than their opinion on how this crisis should be handled is what their relationship is with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, considering that these organizations spend millions lobbying and earn billions bombing. At no point did MSNBC mention that Bash, who served as chief of staff at the Central Intelligence Agency in the Department of Defense in the Obama administration, leads a consulting firm that has reportedly worked for defense contracting giant Raytheon, which supplies missiles for Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Remember, if you have a strong affiliation to Israel, if you are Israeli, if you are Jewish, I am not saying that you don't have the right to your emotional experience right now. Who the hell am I to comment on that? Where I do feel qualified to pontificate is should Jeremy Bash, former CIA head, current member of consulting firm that reportedly works with Raytheon, be pretending to be, well, not even neutral, offering advocacy without declaring profiteering, which I think, if you take away your personal alliances, has informed almost every conflict in the last 100 years, and perhaps is the primary motivation for all wars. There is enough historic complexity in that region without the intercession of profiteering, without a legacy media not declaring their true motivation, true alliances, and where they're getting their information from. The episode is part of a broader recurring pattern in corporate TV news. In recent weeks, MSNBC, NBC, CNN, and Fox News have regularly invited on former defense officials turned industry consultants to explain the conflict between Israel and Palestine without ever mentioning to viewers that these analysts may represent clients with a financial stake in matters being discussed. Wouldn't you want to know, if you were being offered a solution to a problem, that the person that's offering you that solution has a vested interest in a particular outcome?
If you have 3 Pepsis and drink 1, how much more refreshed are you?
Pepsi?
Partial credit.
Doesn't it make you consider more broadly that America's role in the world is supplying weapons, often to both sides of a conflict, that you have people in Congress investing in weapons firms during this conflict, the legacy media have people that work for weapons firms talking to you during the conflict? Do you think that's helping us to get an unbiased assessment? As we try to tiptoe through this tragedy, with lives are being lost continually, unnecessarily, certainly it doesn't appear to be leading to a solution, one might argue, don't you want to ensure that the information you're getting is the best possible information from the best possible people? people, how else are we ever going to achieve anything other than endless ongoing war? Endless ongoing war. I wonder if anyone would benefit from an endless ongoing war. I wonder if our intensity and willingness to take sides would benefit any of these interests that sell arms all around the world, often to both sides, turn up on your TV set advocating for war without declaring those investments, have a Congress full of people that are supposed to be representing you while investing in those weapons companies, having accepted lobbying money from those weapons companies while they work within a party that accepts donations from those weapons companies. That seems to me like a 360 dome that's worth interrogating. On October the 12th, Fox News interviewed Beacon managing director and partner Michael Allen, who served as a top National Security Council official under President George W. Bush. CNN also interviewed Beacon senior counselor Leon Panetta, who served as CIA director and Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. While we are all good as tribalized creatures with a deep, long history, perhaps longer than we ever imagined or history reports, have lived with natural alliances with groups that we feel affiliation because our survival and their survival are completely entwined. It's clear from that little list that whether you're Republican or Democrat, pro-Bush or pro-Obama, left or right, there's a little group of intersecting, crossing over folks making a lot of money and making a lot of noise, generally advocating for further conflict on either and both sides, porously moving between media, defense, government, corporatization, effortlessly and endlessly. Meanwhile, down here in the dirge, we all sort of wave flags and squabble with one another about particular advocacy. And as I've said many times, I understand that if you are personally affected by this, of course, I'm in no position to judge your alliances. I wouldn't dream of it. But surely we can agree that having a system where people profiteer and sit in different chairs, in different hats, advocating usually for more war and more expenditure isn't the best way to solve these heartbreaking global problems. Neither Fox nor CNN noted it was interviewing executives at Beacon and chose only to identify them by their former government titles. If your partner brought someone around there and said, oh, this is my sister's friend Derek, and didn't mention that they had had a long-lasting love affair with Derek, I'd say, you mentioned that it was your sister's friend. What you didn't tell me is that you had a long relationship with them. Why was that? Is it because you maybe thought that that would bias my impression of that person if you'd given us that one bit of information? Yeah, I thought I would keep that back. Let's not make this about that I would have with Derek, my sister's friend Derek. Telling you that someone's a government official and not mentioning that they've got strong ties to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin seems like a pretty deliberate choice to me, doesn't it? So let's follow that line. Right, they didn't tell us that. Why? Oh, because then we'd think that the information they was giving us was biased towards spending more money on like Raytheon products and Lockheed Martin products. What does that mean more generally? Oh, well, they benefit from war. Right, so in conflict situations, what type of attitude are they going to take? Probably like a pro-war stance. Right, so what should we make sure we include in our analysis of the situation? The potential that the war's not actually for the reason that they're saying it is probably for another reason, potentially for another reason. And finally, what the hell are we going to do about Derek? Forgive him? NBC's Israel News coverage has also relied on executives at West Exec Advisors, a defense industry consulting firm that was founded by former Obama administration officials, including Antony Blinken, who now serves as Biden's Secretary of State. Do you see a theme developing? Do you see what's happening here? Again, if you are connected to the loss of life in Gaza or the loss of life in Israel, you are in a tragic situation that I do not feel qualified to comment upon. But having people moving between administrations, moving between agencies, advocating for bombing, same as the free speech argument in a way, isn't it? Sometimes people go, do you know what we should do? Censor people that are saying something that I disagree with. And once in a while you think, yeah, I'd love people. Do you know what I'd like to see censored? People attacking me. I wish people would censor that. But actually, free speech is more important to me because it's a principle. It's a principle. The whole problem that we have in the world right now is no one's got any values. No one's got any principles. Not when it comes to the top strata of governing the world. They will mouth the words of principles and values, but meanwhile, undisclosed connections to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Without transparency, without clarity, without a legacy media with values and principles, and let's face it, we don't have one, we're never going to navigate our way through this treacherous swamp.
Ship Show.
If you recall, if you were following me back in the day, back in 2008, when a lot of people started following me, one of the many reasons that I was against the bailouts, the bank bailouts, the TARP program, was that I knew that if we bailed out these too big to fail banks, that the next time we had to bail them out, they would be even bigger. So if they're too big to fail, then let's let them fail. Because why keep them alive so that they can get a lot bigger? So that when they fail in the future, it's even worse. Because if they were too big to fail in 2008, what are they now? Because all of those banks that we bailed out are much, much bigger now than they were then. And they're in much more trouble now than they are then, than they were then. And so at least they're writing about this. But they still don't get the severity of this. And it's not just the interest payments. It's the principal. It's not just that we can't pay the interest, but we have to pay the principal. You know, for years, people used to tell me, Peter, why are you worried about the debt? You know, we never have to pay that back. All that counts is the interest. We have to pay the interest, but we don't have to pay back the principal. In fact, if you ask most experts today, they'll say the same thing. We don't have to pay the principal. Well, my response to that was always, what do you mean we don't have to pay back the money? I mean, we borrowed it. It's a loan. I mean, that's the whole, nature of a loan, right? This isn't a gift that we got. The national debt wasn't a gift. It's debt. By its nature, debt has to be repaid. So when they would say we don't have to repay the debt, I would say, well, did you run that by the Chinese? Did you run it by the Japanese? Do they know that that's the deal? Do they know that they're loaning us money, but they're never going to get it back? Because, that's not a loan. That is a gift. They're not giving us this money. They are loaning it, and that means they expect to get it back. Now, of course, what people would tell me is, well, of course we will pay them back because we'll borrow it from somebody else. So in other words, it's a Ponzi scheme, right? So Bernie Madoff never had to worry about paying back money because he would get it from the next sucker who didn't realize it was a Ponzi scheme. Well, what happens when people realize it's a Ponzi scheme? They don't want to participate. And that's what's going on. Our creditors don't want to loan us more money to pay back the other creditors. That is what is happening. That is why bond yields are going up, because the people who own the bonds want their money back as they mature, and we can't find new buyers. Now, prices are moving down and yields are going up, and so we're enticing some buyers into the market, but there's not enough. And here's the problem. Because normally you would think, okay, if there aren't people willing to buy treasuries, well, the yields will go up, and then the higher yields will be an inducement to buy. But it doesn't really work that way, because in this circumstance, as interest rates goes up, that impedes the solvency of the United States. Because as interest rates go up, we need to borrow more money to pay that interest, which means the debt goes up. As the debt goes up, America becomes a worse credit risk. And it becomes even more likely that we have to create even more inflation to service that debt, let alone repay the debt. So higher interest rates don't actually make treasuries more attractive. They make them less attractive. That is the problem. This is a bottomless pit. This is a self-perpetuating collapse that we are witnessing that is going to gather momentum. So what's happening is we have to pay back the principal, the money that we've owed, because we can't find people. We have very short maturities on the national debt. And this goes all the way back to President Clinton. I was listening to Sean Hannity interviewing the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Jordan, right, who's now the Speaker. We finally have the Speaker of the House. And he was talking to Mike Jordan, and Mike Jordan was talking about the Trump economy. And he said that, when Donald Trump was president, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world, right? That is the lie that I think will win Trump re-election. I mean, that's what the Republicans are going to say. Maybe some of them actually believe this. But we didn't have the greatest economy in the history of the world. I mean, it wasn't even close. I mean, we didn't even have the greatest economy in the history of America. We didn't have the greatest economy in the 21st century. We had a bubble under Trump. Trump didn't create the bubble. He inherited the bubble, and he made it bigger. That bubble is now popped under Biden. That's what's happening. Most likely, had Trump been reelected, it would have popped on his watch. Who knows, right? But this was inevitable. But the origins, really, of this bubble go back to Clinton. It goes back to the Greenspan era, although Greenspan was there before Clinton. But the big monetary policy mistakes took place starting in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. And the bubble initially popped when George Bush came in, George W. Bush. And then that's when we started even more reckless policies, because that's when we had the TARP and we got the bubble even bigger with all the quantitative easing that took place mainly under the Biden presidency. So Trump came in there for 4 years, but during those 4 years, he didn't do anything to change the dynamics. The deficits got bigger under Trump. The trade deficits hit new record highs. We increased government spending. Yes, the Fed ratcheted up interest rates somewhat, but all that stopped, of course, when COVID hit. But Trump wasn't the game changer. He kept the game going. That's all he did. Now, in the scheme of things, was Trump less bad than Obama? Was he less bad than Biden? Yes, he was. But, less bad ain't going to cut it. We actually need a good president, not a president who's less bad than the alternative. But the idea that people think that everything was great just a few years ago and it's all gone to hell, that's wrong, because that assumes that we can just fix it. Really simple, right? We just have to go back to the Trump policies and we're going to be great again. No. This problem is much bigger than just the bad things that Biden has done. But going back to Clinton, it was his Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin. He's the guy that started shortening the maturity of the national debt, meaning that the government would borrow not for 30 years, but 90 days, 1 year, shorter maturities. Why did Rubin do that? Well, it was to make the deficits look smaller. Remember, Clinton was trying to balance the budget. And for a couple of years, with sleight of hand accounting, they did manage a balanced budget. Of course, the national debt actually went up every year that the budget was supposedly balanced, because they didn't count a lot of the spending as part of the official budget. But one of the ways that they brought down the deficit was by reducing the interest expense on the national debt. And how did they do that? They did that by refinancing the debt from longer to shorter maturities, because the shorter maturities had lower interest payments. That's the same thing a lot of Americans did with housing. They took adjustable rate mortgages. They got teaser rates because the rates were lower. Now, of course, the trade-off was risk that eventually rates could go up. But politicians will make that trade-off, because the trade-off that Rubin made with Clinton was that, yes, in the long run, this is bad for the country because we should be locking in these low interest rates. And in the long run, rates are going to go up, but that's somebody else's problem because, Clinton won't be in office when this bomb explodes. So in the meantime, let's have a short-term financing of the debt, and it'll be the next president's problem when interest rates went up. Well, when Bush became president, he did the same thing. He shortened the maturity. When Obama became president, he shortened the maturity. And Trump did the exact same thing. While he was president, he didn't take advantage of the low interest rates to try to lengthen the maturity of the national debt. He actually continued the politically expedient but long-term disastrous policies of making that deal with the devil, of shortening maturities, knowing that the bomb would blow up in the future, and that's what's happening right now on Biden's watch. Now interest rates are soaring, and all that short-term debt that we've been taking on for 20 years, now it's maturing, and we have to roll it over at 525, 550 basis points. We could have locked it in years ago for 30 years at 200 or 300 basis points, but we didn't do that because it was cheaper to finance it at 25 basis points. But now we're paying the price, and it's going to escalate into this complete sovereign debt and currency crisis, which has already started, but is a long way from ending.
Here first from Thomas Jefferson in his opinion against the constitutionality of Alexander Hamilton's horrible national bank in 1791. He said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people." This was 10 months to the day before ratification of the Bill of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson is hammering home that he sees the 10th Amendment as the foundation, the structure of the entire Constitution. What is not delegated is automatically reserved. Now, there was a big reason why this structure of delegated and reserved powers was so important, was so foundational, not just as an add-on, but to the entire structure of the document. It's actually a legal rule of construction. It tells us how to read the entire Constitution. The Ninth Amendment is one as well. But the reason is that so many in the founding generation, a vast majority, of course there were outliers like Alexander Hamilton, but a vast majority of the founders, the framers, the founding generation saw consolidation or centralization of power as a massive threat to the liberties of the people. Patrick Henry thought it was the greatest danger, and he railed against consolidation over and over and over in the Virginia ratification debates in June of 1788. Here's a couple of quick examples. June 5th. There's one thing in it which I never would acquiesce in. I mean, the changing it into a consolidated government, which is so abhorrent to my mind. Just absolutely abhorrent is the idea of consolidation. And on June 7th, he said, "Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive." And he said also, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. He said it's absolutely guaranteed. Mike Maharrey put it this way, quote, "If consolidation ends in the destruction of our liberties, as Patrick Henry put it, the key to regaining liberty is unconsolidation, or to use an actual word, decentralization, the system of federalism that is reinforced or affirmed by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution for these United States." John Taylor of Caroline, the great Jeffersonian, in Construction Construed and Constitutions Vindicated 1820, the whole thing will be linked to, you can read it, that'll be in the show notes, pointed out that this is the way you secure or preserve liberty. He said, "The preservation of liberty must depend on the division of power between the state and federal governments, or an accurate distinction between the powers bestowed and reserved." And I know I'm citing a lot of Virginians here, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Taylor of Caroline, but it wasn't just the Virginians. And I know I mentioned John Jay as well. Up in Massachusetts, ratification in early 1788 was almost certainly going to fail. And if it failed in Massachusetts, it was probably going to fail in New York, New Hampshire, Virginia. The Constitution would have been dead in the water. They were whipping votes and they were tallying up, and the votes against were pretty solidly in the lead. So Federalists, primarily people like Theophilus Parsons, Rufus King, and a few others, they worked out a deal with John Hancock and Samuel Adams. We know that John Hancock was probably drafting some proposed amendments to the Constitution pretty early on, even before the ratifying convention in Massachusetts. And so the proposal and the strategy was, okay, we'll agree to ratify, but we're going to recommend amendments, and you are going to agree because, we are brothers in arms. You're going to agree to go along with this. And maybe we won't get all of these amendments, but if we start this process and all the other states start doing this, we're going to end up with amendments to the Constitution or a Declaration of Rights. And actually, in many cases, probably some people wanted both. Now, here's the absolute number one thing that Massachusetts recommended for ratification. And mind you, we know, and there are some letters discussing this in 1789, when there was a delay by the Federalists to actually propose the amendments, we know that everyone was aware that the Constitution probably would not have succeeded had it not been for this approach. So Hancock's first one, well, we'll call it John Hancock's, was this. First, that it be explicitly declared that all powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved to the several states to be by them exercised. So without that recommended amendment, a precursor, it's not obviously the exact same thing. It's based more on the Articles of Confederation. Without saying there's delegated and reserved powers and there's a clear line in the sand, the Constitution wouldn't even exist, most likely. It probably would not have passed. So that's incredibly important. That was in February of 1788. And then in June, New Hampshire used the exact same language. And the number one thing for their ratification was also that it be explicitly declared that all powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved to the several states to be by them exercised. In New York, they had a very similar approach. They had their version of a precursor to the 10th Amendment, number 3, but it ties in very closely because it is about delegating reserved powers. And if power flows from the people they're delegating, it ties in with their first one as well. Let me read it all to you here. That all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people, and that government is instituted by them for their common interest, protection, and security. And so then the third on that list is, these are their recommended amendments when they ratified in July of 1788. That every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments of the government thereof, remains to the people of the several states or to their respective state governments to whom they may have granted the same. So in New York was also a very close vote, even after Massachusetts. It may have lost there if they weren't able to recommend amendments. And right close to the top, if not very top, depending on how you read this, is another precursor to what became the 10th Amendment. June 26, 1788. First, that each state in the Union shall respectively retain every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Constitution delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of the federal government. That's the first amendment that Virginia recommended in their ratification document, June of 1788. North Carolina used the same text in their approach the following year. In South Carolina, they're a little wishy-washy. They only include their kind of 10th Amendment precursor second when they ratified. They said, this convention doth also declare that no section or paragraph of the said Constitution warrants a construction that the states do not retain every power not expressly relinquished by them and vested in the general government of the Union. Now, closing it out here, I think John Hancock has a great statement. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. He pointed out that it is the reserved powers of the people that can keep them free. Now, of course, it's up to the people to use those powers that have been reserved to them, people of the several states, to use the powers reserved to them in ways that support the Constitution and liberty instead of how they've been using it for generations and generations, and that is in support of more and more federal power.
This, I think the big question is, will he move us toward runaway inflation, or do you think he will lead us to a balanced budget? But just what are your thoughts economically about what's going on and what it might be like, with the new speaker?
But I think the situation is very tough, regardless of who holds the position of Speaker. Johnson's proposed taking up individual bills between now and November 17th. That's when the current funding expires. He said another stopgap measure, known as a continuing resolution, might be needed to prevent the Senate from jamming the House with a Christmas omnibus, referring essentially to a consolidated spending bill. He said a continuing resolution could have a deadline of January 15th or April 15th, depending on the consensus in the GOP. But a continuing resolution is just more of the same at the end of the day. Maybe a continuing resolution is better than an omnibus bill, but either way, I think it's time to start getting back to the way government budgets are supposed to be crafted. It's that simple, and we're still not there yet. So I think it's more of the same. We've got to start focusing on a plan for sustainable debt reduction, just not overspending, and we're a long way away from that, it feels. And we're getting to the point of no return, and we talk about the costs of spending, and the costs of spending are real. In fact, debt service costs rose 33% this year from last. Now, just the interest payments on our debt alone are similar to our defense budget, which dwarfs that of every other nation combined in the top 10, for some context. So it's becoming problematic, and it's starting to compound. We borrowed $2 trillion last year. 700 billion of that was just for debt service payments. It's obscene.
Yes, there's getting back to the Fed, because I can't think of deficits or how big government is and why they're doing it without talking about the Fed, because that's really the engine that keeps this and perpetuates it. And as long as there's belief in the Fed and fiat, things will limp along, and we're doing actually better than I would have predicted if we could print all this money that we have. But I think most of us realize that this can't last. Even the Fed has said, oh well, this can't last. And there was an article here that I clipped, and the headline is, what can the Fed do about the deficit? And the conclusion was nothing. They can't do anything about it. And the longer I was in Congress, I got the same message from the Fed, because I was always on the banking committee. And when I present a question to them, about the spending, they say, oh, and even this week the chairman said, oh, we don't talk about finances and spending. We separate ourselves. And what I want to suggest that there's a reason for this, and see if I get your opinion on this. And that is that they're worrying about the loss of independence. They talk about independence, and the other one on Zero Hedge says dollar's fate is sealed as the Fed's independence is eroded. And well, maybe credibility is being eroded, but independence isn't there. They're always saying the Fed's over here independent, and they always, anytime I ask them this question, they always say it's Congress's fault. They spend too much money. They put the pressure on us to do this. And I wonder about the theory, Philip, about maybe this is not exactly that way. Maybe they know exactly what they're doing. Maybe they work together. Maybe they're in collusion and saying, spend and go ahead and support the empire. We'll take care of it. Where do you come down on that theory?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it that the Federal Reserve at times has certainly acted in a political manner, and it seems to be the case that they sort of cry independence when people look at collusion, and it's clear to others that I think there are elements of that, but the Federal Reserve, I think, in on itself is a big problem.
Yes, and the statistics on inflation right now, they're not real good. Even this morning, it came out from the Michigan study, and it was much higher than expected. So at times the government, fudges those figures too. Those nominal figures, aren't reliable. And have you sensed that people sort of look away from there? They have to deal with what they'll do to the market, but they really don't believe that we get accurate information from the government, even on economic statistics.
I think everybody I speak to at least is fully aware of that. I mean, the government are suggesting headline inflation is at 3.7%. Anybody who goes to a grocery store understands it's not our reality. And I tell people, if you just calculate inflation in the same way the government did in the 80s, it would put it closer to 13% today. So the public aren't fooled, and the reality is we're feeling it, right? Wage inflation is trailing actual inflation. We're seeing credit card debt spiral. We're now starting to see defaults. The American people can't be fooled by numbers because we feel the reality.
A couple words about your assessment of Bidenism. You put in a fancy word, it must be fancy program. And it came out with a burst, but I think even those who proposed it aren't bragging so much anymore. But give us your opinion about what all that is. What really were they aiming for, and where do you think it's going to end?
Did you say Bidenism? I misheard. Sorry.
Bidenism. Biden's programs. He came out and had all his program, and because there was a fancy word on there, it was a solution to our problem. Deficits don't hurt. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think it's nonsense. For me, it's a cynical attempt to buy votes. I think we're overspending at a time when we clearly shouldn't be overspending. As I mentioned before, the spending itself in large part has been very wasteful, right? Biden was pushing to pay off student loans, right? Think about that as a concept. We're carrying more debt today than any nation has ever held in history, and we think it's a priority to start paying off student loans. I mean, the whole concept is counterintuitive, and that's why I say the cynic in me thinks this is just a desperate attempt. We're in debt. Why not just rack up more debt and try and buy ourselves another 4 years? It feels literally like that.
And a lot of times people say prices are up. But the reason I point this out is you can't blame the businessman's profits, or you can't blame labor costs going up and saying that's inflationary. The labor prices are going up, and that's going to cause everything to go up. And yet that is a price that has an effect on the monetary system and the monetary policy of our governments.
Very clear. government spending leads to aggressive inflation, and we're spending at a rate that has never been seen before in history. And what's so concerning is those in Washington don't seem to understand the gravity of the actions. And now we look at what's happening globally with the dollar. We are incentivizing countries around the world to dump the dollar. And this is where this stuff becomes very dangerous. Look, at some point, we'll iron out this inflation, we'll deal with bubbles in the economy. We lose a grip on global reserve currency. No nation has ever regained that in history. And that's where a presidential term, in my mind, can become very dangerous.
Yeah. You need information. The founders had it. They tried to get us into the right direction. We did it for a while, but we've gone in the wrong direction. That's why the information, Philip, that you're talking about is very necessary. We have to follow up, and I encourage people to check it out. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.